This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Sarah Jane Cervenak, who teaches in the departments of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and African American and African Diaspora Studies at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. In addition to a number of scholarly articles, she is the author of Wandering, Philosophical Performances of Racial and Sexual Freedom from 2014 and Black Gathering, Art, Ecology, Ungiven Life from 2022. Across this conversation, we discuss the relation between performance studies and Black studies, the meaning of Black study in the classroom, and the place of expressive culture in the field. Good afternoon, Sarah. How are you today?
I'm good, Sean.
You know, it's we were talking before recording. It's school's out. I still have to do my grades, but school's out, so things are better. And it's really nice to have a chance to talk with you today and transition from the semester into podcast life and talk to you, hear your thoughts on Black studies and related fields in your research. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really happy you're here. I think your work is super interesting and has so much to contribute to the field. So I just want to say I appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you so much, John. I'm happy to be here.
So as a way of getting started, sort of set aside for a moment how you think about the field of Black studies and how you imagine your work in relation to it. And just ask you a more personal question, which is, how did you come to the study of Black life? What interested you and drew you to Black studies? Sort of what is that intellectual, political, cultural journey like for you? And always for me, something that I think is interesting, which is what sustains you in relationship to this kind of work?
Wow, those are great questions. So I did my undergraduate training in women's studies, and was trained by Black feminist thinkers in terms of the reading Black and Latinx feminist thinkers, and this is the 90s. Often taking Black and Latinx feminist theory courses were adjacent to, women's studies courses that tended to focus, white feminist thinkers, right? And so really trying to think intersectionally always about questions around gender and sexuality. And that's how my kind of intellectual scholarly training began. My undergraduate thesis was on the relationship between white supremacy and gay bodybuilding culture in New York City. And so I had been thinking and critically reading scholarship that was coming out of sort of whiteness studies, that was interrogating white supremacy. So that was my project. So really always kind of interested in critically interrogating whiteness and white supremacy from the vantage of women of color feminisms, critical whiteness studies, et cetera. When I was thinking about graduate schools, I wasn't sure. I wasn't, I'm coming from an interdisciplinary degree, that's women's studies. And I'm interested, which, as a field itself, because it's sort of integrally related with other fields, right? Disability studies, African American studies, queer theory. I was doing readings in all these sort of different places. And so I didn't have a sense when I was finishing undergrad, like I am going to pursue a PhD in English, or I want to pursue. And so I saw performance studies. I was in New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey. Performance studies is 40 minutes away at NYU. And I was looking at it, and performance studies was intriguing to me because of the way, for two reasons. One, they're insistently interdisciplinary. And when I was introduced to the field, it was an they basically invited you to, sit with art and social life from the vantage of Black studies, post-colonial theory, queer theory, feminist theory. I remember that all those were available, right, to enter into. And because I was an undergraduate finishing and not actually wanting to kind of commit disciplinarily, and also really just kind of shaped by interdisciplinary training and conversations, performance studies became a place, right? And so then I started from day one with Professor Fred Moten, taking courses on Black studies, particularly Black performance studies, and that were always shaped by readings by Black feminist thinkers, historians and African American studies historiographers, readings like Sterling Stuckey and, Lawrence Levine, and, that were really thinking about anti-slavery activism, and also vis-a-vis Saidiya Hartman's work. I mean, which Scenes of Subjection came out in 97. I started graduate school in 98. So that was almost like, it was a landmark text for all of us, right? And but it was also like, as a student, I'm reading Scenes of Subjection with, by Saidiya Hartman with Fred Moten. And so, my training in Black studies really developed, or really kind of intensified through a performance aesthetic, critical engagement. Right. And so yeah, I mean, I think that's where I started. I also didn't come from a theater background. I didn't, when I got there, I was like, oops. I haven't been reading plays. I'd been interested in aesthetics because of my undergraduate sort of interest in the way that, bodily self-fashioning can enact and sustain white supremacy, how white supremacy was enacted and sort of embodied and critiqued. And these are aesthetic questions just as much as they're political. I don't think I understood them as aesthetic questions at the time. I was also, my sort of the texts were literary. They were literary in orientation. And, when Fred was my teacher, advisor, continues to be a mentor, and is also approaching the field with a literary background. And so for me, one of the provocations of performance studies is how to reimagine, right, one's relationship to cultural production, right? And I think with respect to, let's say, reading a book, right? I wasn't trained in literary studies, but I would say that I was probably more trained in literary studies than I was in aesthetic inquiry. So that, and that's K through 12 public schools, right? We're not, the arts are so defunded and degraded and marginalized that, kids are going to come out more with the kind of emphasis on you have to read to understand. And if you know how to read and you can isolate what's on the page, then you can, you know everything. You can, you have a grasp, and it's all. And so one of the things that performance studies helped me do was relate to literature, and particularly African American literature, written by Black women, which was a way that I was thinking alongside Black feminist theory of, an interrogation of whiteness and property personhood, right? And so what performance studies, and Fred has this great essay called Music and the Law of Reading. I hope I'm getting that right, where he's basically, what does reading really mean? How does it, upset, how does the art or music really upset sort of, these Enlightenment protocols of understanding that are also integrally related to histories of racial and economic or ecological, sexual domination. So I returned. Performance studies helped me return to the literary as another aesthetic space that was dimensional, not surface, right? So yeah.
I was definitely laughing as you said, you got to a performance studies and you were like, oh, they really meant the performance part and the theater part.
Right.
It's not the same, but I remember interviewing for my very first position at University of Houston, and they wanted to know if I could teach philosophy of religion. I said, sure, of course, and made something up in the interview context, got the job, and I was like, oh, they make you do this. It's like, when do you apply for something? And then they ask for it. But so, no, this is really interesting. And I think this theme of the aesthetic, the literary, and question of performance is central to an element of Black studies. And that's, definitely part of why I was so excited to have you as part of the series. And so let me start into that, not so much in terms of your own work, but more in terms of how you imagine the field of Black studies. What is a portrait of Black studies that you draw? And I'm thinking of this specifically in relation to its origins as a field,
right?
Which has this sort of tension built into it. On the one hand, the establishment of Black studies was about the study of Black life, something that disciplines up to that point had done very little, if any, study of Black life. And Black studies was going to be that place where that happened, where the intellectual tradition was given its scholarly due, was going to become part of curricula, and of course develop, because every tradition is not just studied, but reproduced and expanded.
Right.
But of course, this is the late 1960s and early 1970s where Black liberation struggle had really pushed against this idea of a distinction between, say, education and community liberation, between the campus and the people. And so part of Black studies is also that moment of political demand and political orientation around, we want prescriptions. We don't just want our life described. We want prescriptions and corrections of the kinds of things we suffer. And so that sense of an intellectual tradition and its political dimension is really at the origin of Black studies. So when you think of Black studies, what's that portrait for you, and how does it relate to this origin story?
Right. That's a great question. I think I'm going to answer the question this way. And I think I'm skipping ahead, John, too, so forgive me in terms of my own teaching. So I teach African-American Afro-diasporic studies, and I teach core courses, right? And one of the courses I teach is the capstone. And part of what we do in that course is think about the history of Black studies as a field, right? It's relationship to the neoliberal university and sort of its own histories of anti-Black extraction, even in the very institutionalization of Black studies. And I also think about one of the things that Black studies as a field, as an orientation, as a conversation has been interested in is what is our relationship to the university? What is our and its and sort of its regimes of hiring and retention. And so I don't know if I'm necessarily answering this question from like a thinking about the sort of the global project of Black studies in terms of like its theoretical and sort of disciplinary orientations, but as a project that has always been about trying to reimagine the possibility of Black social life on university campuses, trying to center Black people's stories about themselves, right, as central to the project of education, right? So what does that mean? So for me, that has meant for scholars in Black studies, and for me as a white person who is a scholar in Black studies, is always to have the conversation about, how do we reflect critically on our relationship to the history and theory of Black social life, right? While acknowledging that the project of Black studies in the context of the university has been about Black people's voices being central, right? And so this shows up in my teaching, right? So that part of what it means is to acknowledge the way I'm situated in relationships at a neoliberal university, to acknowledge the ways in which numbers of Black faculty are low, right? And in the context of my program, there's not a lot of Black faculty on campus teaching Black studies courses. And that for me is a problem. And so, but I think what it connects to is larger critical conversations on how do we imagine community in the conversations on community in the intellectual and university project of Black studies, right? So then what does that look like? So how can we commit ourselves to the project, both in relationship to students, in relationship to, each other as scholars, right? In such a way that I think on an ethical level, right, acknowledges the deep necessity of centering Black people's stories about themselves, right? And so one of the I don't know if this is too rambly, but one of the things that I think is some of the things that I'm excited about Black studies as a field are those occasions of critical self-reflexivity, right? Where scholars, so not just, me in relationship to Black studies, thinking about ways to not replicate whiteness in an aesthetic and political relationship to Black social life in and as the writing, right? But also I'm thinking about Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts, right? And which I teach, and how she thinks about what does it mean for her to tell the story, in terms of even thinking about, Norbesi Phillips' song that cannot be told as a scholar situated in the 21st century, in the face of, no extant slave narratives written by enslaved women who survived the Middle Passage, right? And Hartman's confronting the stakes of writing about that, right? Writing about writing about people who aren't necessarily in the institutionalized university spaces of Black studies, right? Which I think has always been the tension at the heart of the political project of Black studies as a field, is what is the relationship to the community, which we can interrogate, the community is always already in the classroom. And that's one of the things I say to my students, or sometimes it's a dangerous kind of bifurcation to suggest that there's an authentic community that exists outside the classroom within which you study, right? But it is to ask, what is your and taking into account how one is positioned, right? Being an undergraduate Black scholar, or non-Black scholar, right? In relationship to the communities of people who you're writing about who may not be within the institutional context of Black studies. Does that make sense? So I think that Black studies as a political project has always been asking curricular questions that are never not political and ethical in orientation. Right.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. Thank you. It was really thoughtful. And there's a lot there. Not the least of which is I'm glad that you hesitated around that strict divide between the campus and the community as idealized spaces. similar to you, I talk to my students about this, and I'm like, I do go home. I don't live in my office.
Right.
I do have a political life and a social life and an economic life, and all of those things are also here in the classroom with us, and that's true of you as students. Sometimes students take that a little bit deflating, like it's taking something special out of being at a university, but for the most part, I find it invests them with the sense of what they're doing is already connected to all the things they imagine they want to be connected to at some point.
Right.
But it also exposes, I think, how the university functions. Now that I'm making this podcast about me, but I hear a lot of what you're saying in what you're saying is it exposes a lot of how the university imagines itself kind of as a missionary project, which you may not see if it's just like students are coming to learn from you in a sort of, the way sort of white classrooms and white material ends up being kind of transparent and non-racial, non-political. That's a problem, obviously. But as soon as it's about Black studies, we're like, oh, are we just training people to get knowledge here and go make change there? That's the missionary structure.
Right.
Or
absolutely.
are we talking about a much blurrier line that exists across all these classrooms and departments, but is emphatic here and has a feeling of high stakes here?
Right.
So I think that reflexive classroom and the reflexive professor, the reflexive student, as you say, I mean, it's also part of Black studies scholarship, and the Hartman piece is so perfect for that.
Right. Right.
Asking what it means for us to do this. But also that centering of Black people's stories. This question of the politics of Black studies is so interesting, because I even think even just 2 years ago, this question sounds different. I think the centering the stories of Black people's lives is so political that I don't think they're trying to actually ban it in multiple states.
100%. Absolutely. And that's terrifying, actually. And the anti-DEI, even, and I've talked about this with my students, like the Stop Woke legislation in Florida, which is so deeply racialized, even in its codification, right? That it's like, that it's the literal criminalization of Black life, right?
Yeah.
On every level. Yeah.
Yeah, last spring, I was teaching a class on mass incarceration and race, and that criminalization of Black life is a phrase that I use in the class, and I just put it in their ear one day, like, isn't that what the anti-DEI, anti-woke movement is? And I don't think they walked the same for a couple of weeks. They were it's disturbing. It was a class of 90, and I was like, okay, if 90 people think about this, this is like good. We got to...
Absolutely.
I think when you work in these fields, you can see it, but at moment that it's actually criminalizing and not just trying to shape a certain apolitical whatever that would be.
No, right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, let me turn to your research then a little bit and ask you, you work, as you were saying, with literary methods, gender studies, and, I love your written work. Your most recent book, I think, it's just so fantastic. It really engaged with art and performance really deeply.
Thank you.
And so there's so many insights in the study of Black life to be gotten from that combination of literary methods, gender studies, and performance and art studies. So I'm interested, when you reflect on your own work, how do you see it in relation to the history of the field of Black studies? And what new horizons do you see it as either a part of or opening up?
Wow. These questions are big, John, and they're great. I'm trying to think about this. So let me start with maybe the smaller question, which is, and if I could just kind of feed this back, to think about my current work in relationship to the history of the field itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, so one question, for me, and this is something when I've taught, there was a course I taught for a moment called Black Women in the U.S. And central to the syllabus weren't, just the political writings, right? Of Frances Harper and Paula Giddings, right? But it was also and Toni K. Bambara's nonfiction work. But it was actually Black women's literature, right? And so, which is really really sort of integral to the formation of the field of Black studies are Black women's writings. And so I think in that sense, the fact that my approach to, I guess, the critical study, aesthetic engagement with Black social life comes from the vantage of a sustained study with Black women's literature. And so, which for me has always been central to the history and shaping of the field in key ways. So I don't know if that's getting at your question necessarily, but for me, Black studies has always been sort of central. The heartbeat of Black studies has always centrally been Black women's literary and aesthetic production. So there's that. So I also think too, part of engaging Toni Morrison, for example, is Toni Morrison, and this is something that I also say, in the very writing I do, is that she's not just doesn't just do a literary representation of Black social life, but tries to do something in the formal dimensions of writing itself that makes Black social life possible. Whether it's, messing with the grammar, right? Or, and not, and in the sense of making extra space on the page, right? Or doing some, strategic withholdings on the part of characters. And so I know this is a ramble, and I'm not even sure I'm actually answering your question, but I think that, you're
answering it perfectly fine.
Oh, great. But I do think that, and I impart this to students as well, when I talk about Black studies relationships with the past, right? When I engage with my undergraduate majors who are finishing the degree, and I'm one of the key areas of the critical conversations in Black studies has been about Black studies scholars from the 20th and 21st century's relationship to, the sort of, the anti-archive of the Middle Passage, right? Or slave narratives, right, written by white amanuenses, and also the ways in which reading itself has historically been a tactic and strategy of domination, right? Which, from Harriet Jacobs to Toni Morrison have instructed. And so I think there's been a major methodological intervention at the level of reading, right? That you can connect from the 1960s emergence of the field in terms of its curricular challenges and foundational subversions, right? Through to, Black studies, I think has always centrally foregrounded literature, but also the arts and aesthetics, right? Which has been too about subverting and trying to imagine modes of expressivity that elude the white gaze. And so that's my answer.
No, I think this, what Ellison called the lower frequencies, what it means to respond to that as a scholar and to actually try to explore that strikes me, if I'm hearing you correctly, as both a way that the kind of scholarship that you're doing, and this is what I really like about the scholarship, is your scholarship is that's always been a part of Black studies, but it's always the new horizon, because this is sort of the strategy of strategies. Right. And detecting and articulating that it's a paradox, right? How do you articulate what can't be articulated? How do you bring to a journal, to a book, right, that has a certain convention, what was written in order to defy that convention. I've never been a Ralph Ellison scholar, but I'm like, how do you write about Invisible Man without betraying Invisible Man?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And I would say similarly about Beloved, right? Actually imagining Beloved not as an open book, right? In the sense of like, on the one hand, there is a resolution, but it's insistently irresolvable as part of the political project, right? Or irresolved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another question, and this is both about your scholarly imagination, but also your classroom, which I think Black Studies has an impact, of course, on how we think and write, but also in how we construct classrooms and teach and assemble materials. So not typically, but I would say a sort of 80% of the time, when I ask this question, is somebody who has some kind of passageway through a discipline. What's interesting to me is that your actual educational journey does not pass through a discipline.
Right.
Right. As you said, women and gender studies as an undergraduate, performance studies as a PhD student, and then women and gender studies and African American and African diasporic studies as a professor. So you basically have spent your educational life post high school in area studies, in multidisciplinary spaces. So I'm curious how when you reflect on that, how do you think that impacts how you work as a scholar, how you assemble materials to write about and how you write about them? But also, how do you think that immersion in and commitment to area studies and multidisciplinary spaces has not changed, but how it has helped you structure in very specific ways your classroom, your teaching?
Yeah. That's a great question. Let me start with the latter. So as a teacher, I've always tried to do sort of multimedia in the classroom, music, using art, I remember actually when the first time I taught Intro to African American Studies, which was 15 years ago, at UNC Greensboro, I taught one of the Zong poems by Amnorvesi Philip. And I remember putting one of the poems on the projector, and my students, and giving the students the context, right? Gregson versus Gilbert, right? The terrible mass murder that happened on the Zong ship in relationship to anti-Blackness and financial capitalism. And my students saying, I don't know what's going on here. Like, really talking about naming disorientation. And I said, that's the point. That's the point. And I said, what would it mean to think about in terms of your education, like, on the one hand, and this is what I say, right? When studying, histories of enslavement and, reading histories and historiographies, right? And on slavery, right? Reading slave narratives. But there's also a whole domain that is completely incomprehensible, which has to do with trauma, right? What can't be named, what eludes naming. And the Zong poems were the only place that I could create or actually foster a space in the classroom for students to grapple, like something about the aesthetic provocation, right? Which is like what can't be known, what shouldn't be known, what can't be translated, right? What is not meant to cohere, okay? And for students to get that and to sit with that and then to say, well, okay, like this is part of the story is learning the facts and the histories and about the slave codes and right and the strategies of resistance, right? And Harriet Jacobs but it's also about this whole domain of unknowability, right? And so, which I think Black writers have, also tried to sort of comport towards unknowability from another kind of vantage, right? Through the fictive. And so in that sense, a multimedia approach has often been really key for me. And it's also, I think, shows up in my scholarly practice, so that my books are these kind of, they're a bit wayward, methodological. Well, I don't actually don't. I hope that there's no method in that. I hope there's no method to be discerned, and I think if there is, or there's a resistance to method that I hope that I sort of try to drive home. That method is actually the problem, but I do think that my journey, as it were, as a scholar, has been to not be well. On the one hand, I am faithful to literature, the literary, but also not in the sense of a certain kind of protocol of reading and of literary analysis that encloses meaning, right? And so that I wind up, being really interested in other formal interventions in the shaping of meaning. So, I could be captivated by a sculpture, right? And want to write about a sculpture. And also, too, I think different forms present challenges to us as writers that I'm interested in. Yeah. Right. And so, and especially when you're writing or attempting, I never say I write on art, but alongside it or with it, or because I think that there's fundamental dimensions that cannot be named, discussed, and shouldn't be. Right. And so I think that's the line, that's the long arc, right, between my scholarly and my pedagogical practice.
Yeah, no, that was great. That's really thoughtful and interesting response. I always say, I teach Zong. I think so many of us teach Zong these days, which is really fantastic. There's when I teach it, the question of perplexity comes up, right? And that's where you're supposed to be. And I always say, I could have taught you an essay on perplexity, but there's nothing less perplexifying than an essay on perplexity.
Right.
But that experience of it, I think, is really interesting. And I think then when they read the epilogue, I forget what it's called, afterward epilogue, where she really explains the history and the orientation of the project, the students get very upset and unnerved, and I think the perplexity opens up that space for exactly the effects and affects,
right,
of what it means to talk about the Middle Passage.
Right.
I have a philosophy PhD, and Socrates said, philosophy begins in perplexity, and I just feel like the entire history of white Western philosophy just unfolded as de-perplexification, or
absolutely,
whatever the right word is for that.
Right.
And, but I love retrieving that, and I always love that sense, right? Like to be stung by the eel, is the origins of our wisdom. But to sit with that perplexity in those moments, finding those texts and how to write about it is its own task. I think that's probably for a lot of us a lifelong art form of our own.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a sort of big question about the field of Black studies. This is a question I ask, and I thought it was going to be a fun question for people, but people seem to feel stressed out by this one. It's Ashley and I wrote these questions together, and I think we both had kind of ideas already as responses, and so we forgot what it was like for these to be dropped in somebody's inbox. But looking at the history of the field of Black studies, what do you think that the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
What has it done well? I think I'm going to answer the first question, and I'm going to refuse the second, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Okay. So I think what the field has done well is its insistence on interdisciplinarity. I think as a field itself, the commitment to the theory and study of Black social life has meant that that new kinds of questions, right, that have always been there, but scholarship, in Black disability studies, critical Black scholarship on Black ecologies, these sort of subfields, if we can call them that, or have emerged precisely because the unfinished conversation about which is, Black studies, political and ethical project. What does it mean to be Black in the world? It has to constantly invent and expand and elaborate itself. And so I think that's what's amazing, right, about Black studies, is that it's expansiveness, right? It's expansiveness, and also, too, I would say, right, yes, Black studies has always, I think, integrally been moved not only by African-American literature, but also the arts, and such that, I went to a great show in New York City called Sprawl Space, which is about how Black artists have engaged with writing, like writing as a not just as an imagistic or literary, but like also as a figurative, sculptural practice, right? And I think Black studies has lent it so that it's not just about, like, in sort of the 60s and 70s, attention has been about, and even I think in the 80s, right? Like what, service learning, or the relationship between Black studies and, the imagined community outside the university, or what is it doing to make changes in relationship to, the university's historically colonial relationship to the cities that it moves within, right? But also that it travels, like where it becomes part of, like, curators imagining of I don't know any other field besides feminist theory in terms of like these interdisciplines that curators are centrally drawing upon to imagine shows, right? Yeah. To if that makes sense. And so, and there's something about the field that makes that possible, right? And I also think that Black studies challenging, constant, not just in terms of thinking about the divide between the university and the campus or the community, but also thinking about what does it mean to know? What does it mean to attempt to translate that knowing? The arts have been, really crucial for putting pressure on those questions. And I think I've seen in amazing ways conversations that are happening in the context of Black studies classrooms happen directly in the context of the museum space, right? And so I think that's if it's sort of to abide by the question, that's I think what Black studies has done really well. Success and failure are funny categories, right? And
I did say has not done particularly well.
No, I know that's it. No, you're right. You're absolutely right, John. I don't know. I mean, I have to think about it. I'm actually not sure. I guess that I am going to answer the question a little differently. Okay. And not necessarily about Black studies, but about the institution in relationship to the political project of liberation. I think there is these. Okay, one of the things that Black studies has always taught us is that we need to think critically, right, about what it means to move within the university, right, and what it means to move within these sort of codified spaces that sometimes demand particular modalities of interpersonal performance, right? Like ways of engaging, or, forms of like, it's imagining a degree from Harvard is somehow better than a degree from UNC Greensboro, right? Or, and so I think that academics could be generally more, especially those of us who are committed to the political project of multiple liberations, Black, queer, feminist, right? To imagine how our own being in these spaces that have historically been elite and exclusionary, how we can move against that in our interpersonal praxis.
I like that.
So that is something that I think the fields that we can do better, 100%. Yeah.
And that's a difficulty of being a fresh new field. I mean, 50-something years is just not that long. And it's like you have to struggle for funding and FTE lines and all of that.
Absolutely.
Then you have to also maintain your vision, which is, is always supposed to be and wants to be more unsettled than, say an anthropology department or so forth.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I will say, you're talking about museum spaces and curatorial practices. I just will say in intra podcast, the podcast by Christina Knight and Stephanie Sparling Williams are fantastic this way. Christina Knight is at Rutgers in art history, and Stephanie Sparling Williams is a curator at the Brooklyn Museum. And Stephanie especially speaks directly to what you were saying about how her own Black Studies training has transformed the way she does curatorial practice and the way so many people do. So
that's great.
I love that claim, and I love that coming up in multiple podcasts, because I just think that's so important. Because, I mean, as if I can sort of paraphrase Stephanie, I mean, museums are community spaces. They are these places that, they're in neighborhoods. And people walk in and out of them, and the way if Black Studies can have a life there, that's an important life to have.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, let me ask you a final question, which is not unrelated to what we were just talking about, and that is to ask, thinking about the field of Black Studies, what is the one issue you think we should all be thinking about, or the one question we should all be asking? Not at the exclusion of others, but
of course.
What is the question or issue that Sarah thinks we should be thinking about?
I think it's a question. I think the field has always asked this question. I think that we need to continue to ask about Black Studies engagement with trying to imagine other livable forms on and with Earth. I mean, I remember with Fred Moten in a conversation with Ronaldo Walcott said that, Black Studies, has a commitment to saving the Earth, right? And so what is that? For me, I think that the conversations that are happening in Black Studies around non-human, thinking about the non-human, Black Studies relationship to the non-human, right? Not just in terms of the history and the philosophy of anti-Blackness, right? In terms of being excluded from humanity, but also thinking about like floral life, right? Animal life, for modes of relationality that are governed or animated by enclosure or settlement. I think the Earth is on fire. It's being devoured, right, by war and settler colonialism and extraction. And how can Black Studies continue to raise the critical conversations on ways of thinking relationality that are not about killing the planet? And those are coming out of critical Black ecologies, they're coming out of Black feminist thought. And so I think I'm most interested in seeing how Black Studies takes up in new and different ways, and also continuing the conversation about reimagining earthly relationalities.
I love that. That's a fantastic place to conclude. I mean, somebody should have a book series on Black ecologies and Black outdoors.
Yeah.
I will make a link to your and Jay's series, which is fantastic. And I think the series is really interesting, but your articulation of the rationale for this kind of work is that was really well put. And everyone listening, that gives us a lot to think about, and how our own research, whatever it might be, intersects with these questions. Because as you say, this is not something that is a pet project or a side project of the Earth. It's kind of important to where we are. I don't know how else to put it.
Absolutely.
Well, Sarah, I was really looking forward to this. This has been such a fantastic conversation. It was exactly what I was hoping. And I love your insights and your thoughtfulness. So thank you for your time, but mostly thank you for really bringing so many things for us to think about to the podcast series.
Oh, thank you so much, John. I appreciate it. And I really love this podcast.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.